Last week we started a series where we're going through the book of Leviticus, God help us. We began with sort of an introduction overview to the series, kind of the basic idea of where Leviticus comes from and some things to keep in mind as we go through. But this week we're actually going to get started with the text. We're going to dive into chapter 1, so if you have a Bible, open to Leviticus chapter 1. That's where we'll begin this morning. I remember being in college. My roommate, a guy named Ben, who to this day is still my best friend. And anytime I say Ben, Katie always has to ask me, Ben in Denver or Ben Hill? We always have to clarify. But I remember being in college, we living together for two and a half years. Sometimes things got a little tense, as happens anytime you live with someone for any extended period of time, I guess. And we would get into these heated arguments, and they would almost always end with one of us having to go to class, usually me, because he never seemed to have to go to class. It was always me going to class. But I would go, and then when class was over, I would come back to the room, and I remember this happened so many times, being on the other side of the door, about to walk in, thinking, is he still mad? I mean, I'm fine, I'm over it, I've cooled down, but is he still upset? Is he even here? And if he is upset, like, should I keep on my side of the room, or is it okay if I talk to him? Should I let him initiate the conversation? Where do I stand with him? It's this feeling of kind of not knowing where the relationship is at a given moment. It's something that I think many of us have gone through at one point or another. Maybe you've gone through it with a boss. I don't know where you stand with the boss. The boss asked to talk to me. He wants me to come into his office after work, and it's Friday, and all of a sudden I don't know where I stand anymore. Or perhaps it's with a spouse or a significant other that she stormed off, and I haven't heard from her in an hour, in several hours, since yesterday. Am I still in the doghouse? Do I need to go get flowers or something? Where do I stand? Or is it just, she just hasn't really said anything. She's just been out of the house. Where do we stand? This is how a lot of people felt about the gods for a long, long time. We don't know where we stand with the gods. There's been a drought. And why has there been a drought? Well, I think it's because the gods must be upset with me. I did this thing and my neighbor says it's okay, but I don't know how the gods feel about it. And so I need to do something to sort of make the gods feel okay so that they'll send rain. And the thing that people came up with, well, what I'm going to do to make the gods happy is I build this altar and I offer a sacrifice to appease the anger of the gods. Well, along comes Leviticus. And Leviticus begins with a detailed outline of how to offer a sacrifice. Oh, you've offended God. You've sinned. You're guilty. You have stain on you, and you need to get rid of that so that you and God can be together again. Well, this is how it's done. And so we begin in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord called to Moses from the tabernacle and said to him, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you present an animal as an offering to the Lord, you may take it from your herd of cattle or your flock of sheep and goats. If the animal you present as a burnt offering is from the herd, it must be a male with no defects. Bring it to the entrance of the tabernacle so that you may be accepted by the Lord." What we're going to witness as this outline of this sacrifice kind of unfolds is we're going to see 6 steps that happen when you go to offer this first sacrifice. And the first step is you present the offering. You present whatever animal it is, whether it's from the herd or from your flocks. You have to present it. And the reason that you present it is you have to make sure that this animal doesn't have any flaws. Now, I didn't have a giant stuffed bull, but I do have a giant stuffed bear, and so we'll just have to use our imaginations and pretend this is a giant stuffed bull for this morning. The first thing that you do is present the animal, and the priest has to inspect it to make sure that this animal is, first of all, male and has no defects, which this one has a little tear in the back, so this one can't present any animals with tears in the back. I guess. But it has to be a perfect male. So assuming that the animal is okay, then you can move on. Where did I put my Bible? You can move on after the first step, which is just present the offering. And it says also to present the offering at the tabernacle. Now that's significant. That already, we're 3 verses in, and already God has taken a shot at idolatry. Because in the pagan world, when you go to offer a sacrifice on an altar to one of the gods, you do that anywhere you want to. You build an altar on the side of the road. You can build an altar on your roof and sacrifice, if you have a flat roof, sacrifice on your roof. You can do it out in the field somewhere. But God says when you want to bring an offering to me, you bring it to the tabernacle. Now, why is it significant that you would come to the tabernacle? Well, if you're following along, turn back just one page to Exodus chapter 40, verse 34. This is after the tabernacle has been built. Verse 34 says, "Then the cloud covered the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could no longer enter the tabernacle because the cloud had settled down over it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." And after a while, you begin to get the impression that God is in the tabernacle. God is there. And when you bring your sacrifice, you don't bring it to the side of the road or to your house, but you bring it to the very house of God, into the very presence of God. You, as a guilty, stained, corrupt person, can come into the presence of God with your offering. So step 1 is present your offering. Picking up in verse 4. "Lay your hand on the animal's head, and the Lord will accept its death in your place to purify you, making you right with him." So step 2 is you would lay your hands on the head of the animal. Now, we've talked in weeks past and in other lessons about the significance of laying hands. It's something that's symbolic throughout Scripture. In the New Testament, you would lay hands to sort of pass the torch from one generation to the next. So a leader is appointed through the laying on of hands. The apostles would take the Holy Spirit that is in them, and they would pass it on to the next person through the laying on of hands. We've talked about in rabbi ordination, a rabbi who's already sort of a part of the chain of rabbis would lay his hands on the next person, and that person receives shmika, or authority, to become the next rabbi. So it's sort of accepting him into our tradition. In the book of Genesis, laying hands has to do with passing a blessing from the older generation to the next generation. So laying hands is always about, I have something that I'm giving to you. And it's not something that I can just wrap up in a box and give to you, but it's authority, it's leadership, it's blessing, it's something that I have. And not only that, but it also speaks to acceptance of another person, of including this other person, that he is part of our tradition now. So when you would lay hands on your sacrificial animal, it's about identifying with this animal. Laying hands is very important because it's a very tangible, tactile way of saying, this is my proxy. This animal is my body double, my stand-in. What's about to happen to this animal is what ought to be happening to me. Okay, so step 2, laying on hands. And then step 3, verse 5, "Then slaughter the young bull in the Lord's presence." So step 3 is slaughter the animal. You don't do a sacrifice without slaughtering. Now, there's debate as to exactly how this would have been done. Jews and Christians both have been talking about how exactly would you have slaughtered the animal? Do you stab it? If there's any kind of consensus, it would be slitting the throat, but that's not at all a consensus. That's just kind of a majority opinion. But you would slaughter the animal. And then picking up in verse 5, "And Aaron's sons, the priests, will present the animal's blood by splattering it against all sides of the altar that stands at the entrance of the tabernacle." So, you've just slaughtered a bull. And a bull has between 4 and 6 gallons of blood, depending on the size of the animal. And the priest comes, and the priest is the one who takes this blood, and he would splatter it on the altar. Which, by the way, thank you, Jim, for building my altar. Sorry that I'm destroying it. But you would splatter the blood on the altar. Now, you're talking about a lot of blood, okay, 4 to 6 gallons. So splattering on all sides, it could take a while, which has actually led some people to think, well, are we really talking about splattering, or is there maybe another word? The New Revised Standard says dashing the blood or throwing the blood. I think perhaps, since you're talking about a 5-gallon bucket, perhaps sloshing the blood would be a good way of understanding what's happening. But on all sides of the altar, you would rub the animal's blood. So, step 1, present the animal. Step 2, lay hands. Step 3, slaughter the animal. Step 4, splatter the blood. And now I can't touch my Bible either. I'll just read off the slides. All right, so that's step 4. Step 4 is present the animal, is splatter the blood. And then step 5, skin the animal and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest will build a wood fire on the altar. They will arrange the pieces of the offering, including the head and the fat, on the wood burning on the altar. But the internal organs and the legs must first be washed with water. So step 5 would be prepare the animal. You have to skin the animal, and you would take the legs, you would sort of dismember it, and you would wash the organs, and you'd wash the legs, and then you would be able to take this animal as it's all cut up, and you would put it on the altar. And then finally, of course, step 6, then the priest will burn the entire sacrifice on the altar as a burnt offering. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Step 6 is you burn the animal. Thank you. So, you begin this sacrifice, this very particular sacrifice, by bringing this animal into the presence of God. You lay hands on it to identify, this is my animal. This is my proxy. What's happening to this animal, I ought to have happened to me. And then you slaughter it, however that is, and you would rub the blood, or you would dash the blood all over the altar on the sides. And then you would cut it up, you would skin it, and burn the whole thing. Often this has been called the whole burnt offering. That's actually a bit of a misnomer, because not the entire animal will go on the altar. If you were to look a little bit further into Leviticus chapter 7, in verse 8, in the case of the burnt offering, the priest may keep the hide of the sacrificial animal. So what all goes on the altar? Everything except the hide or the skin of the animal. It's almost like you're tipping your priest, which then what would you use cow skin to make? Leather. Okay, so priests were probably leather makers by trade when they weren't in the tabernacle. But you would sacrifice everything except the skin. So this has often been called the whole burnt offering because that's the thing that makes it really distinct. Now, I think our next slide is, we'll just go to the next, I'll show you the 6 steps in case you missed one. Present, lay hands, slaughter, splatter, or slosh the blood, prepare the animal, and burn it. One of the things that makes this sacrifice so unique, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus are all about how to present different kinds of sacrifices. And this first one, the thing that makes it unique is that you burn the entire animal. The whole thing, except the skin, is dedicated to God. The skin is given to the priest, but everything else is given. There is no profit for the worshiper. The person who brings it doesn't get to take meat home. It's a total waste because sin is a total waste. The other thing that's really important for us to understand is the reason why you would offer this sacrifice. There are different reasons for each of the 5 sacrifices that we'll look at. We'll only look at 4 of them, but over the next couple of weeks. But there's a reason why you would offer this, and that comes out of verse 4, which tells us that when you offer this animal, you do it to make atonement, or to, my translation says, to make yourself right with God. And the reason that the New Living Translation says make you right with God is because there's a bit of discussion about what it means to have atonement made for you. What does it mean to be atoned for? Some say it's about propitiation, which I know you guys talk about propitiation all the time. Others say it's expiation, which again is not at all a fancy churchy word. So to give you sort of an idea of what the difference is between propitiation and expiation, if you were to install brand new white carpet on your in your house, and then a young boy comes over, young Tommy from across the street, and he spills red Kool-Aid on your carpet, which, by the way, shame on you for serving a 9-year-old red Kool-Aid when you have brand new white carpet. But second of all, so he spills it, and there's this stain, and the stain now has to be dealt with. Propitiation is when you say to the boy, it's okay, don't worry about it, I forgive you, go home and be at peace. Okay, that's propitiation. Expiation is when you get out the steam vac and the carpet cleaner and you remove the stain. Okay, so propitiation, you go home still stained, but forgiven as you are. And expiation is you are changed, that your history is sort of erased and you're no longer stained. So there's some discussion as to what does it mean to have atonement made for you? What is the effect of offering this sacrifice? Do you walk away still stained yet forgiven, or do you walk away a totally different person? I advise you to go and study that for yourself. The other thing that makes this the sacrifice kind of unique is it's called the Olah. Can you say Olah? The Hebrew word is Olah, means burnt offering. When you would offer this sacrifice, there is no profit to you. Now, when you offer this sacrifice, you could come and bring a bull, but we read at the beginning that when you bring your Olah, you could bring your Olah from either the herd, which would be the bull, or from your flocks of sheep or goats. So, let's go ahead and look at that in verses, I think it's picking up in verse 10. If the animal you present as a burnt offering is from the flock, it may be either a sheep or a goat, but it must be a male with no defects. Slaughter the animal on the north side of the altar. Okay, we're witnessing the same 6 steps happening over again. We've already presented the animal. The assumption is that we've laid hands on the animal, or else it's not going to be accepted as our proxy. We haven't identified with it. So you always lay hands on your sacrifice. And then we skip right to step 3. Slaughter the animal on the north side of the altar in the Lord's presence. And Aaron's sons, the priests, will splatter its blood against all sides of the altar. Then cut the animal in pieces, and the priests will arrange the pieces of the offering, including the head and the fat, on the wood burning on the altar. But the internal organs and the legs must first be washed with water. So they'll be preparing. So we've slaughtered the animal, the blood has gone on the altar, and now we've prepared it. And then finally burning, the priest will burn the entire sacrifice on the altar as a burnt offering, as an Olah. It is a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now, when I read this, I think, okay, God, can't you just say, if it's a sheep, just do what you did with the bull? Like, that would save so much time and confusion and ink to just say, just do the same thing. Because you go through the same 6 steps. But there are a couple of minor differences. Instead of slaughtering the animal at the entrance of the tabernacle, you would slaughter it on the north side of the altar, which would be, I think, this side. You would slaughter it on the north side of the altar. Other things, you don't skin this animal. When you bring a sheep or a goat, you don't skin it, and so the priest doesn't get a skin, and he doesn't get to make, I guess it would be wool, not leather. but he doesn't get to make anything out of it. So the entire animal does get burned. And then also, what was the other thing? You only need one priest because you have a much smaller animal that you're working with. So a couple of minor differences between the sheep or goat and the bull. And then there's one more version of this sacrifice in verse 14. If you present a bird as a burnt offering to the Lord, choose either a turtle dove or a young pigeon. The priest will take the bird to the altar, wring off its head, and burn it on the altar. But first he must drain its blood against the side of the altar. The priest must also remove the crop and the feathers, which I don't know what crop and feathers are. Well, I know what feathers are, but I don't know what the crop is. But you remove it, and then you throw it into the ashes on the east side of the altar. And then grasping the bird by its wings, the priest will tear the bird open, but without tearing it apart. Then he will burn it as a burnt offering on the wood burning on the altar. It is a special gift, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So when you come and you bring this bird instead of a bull or a sheep, if you bring a bird, it has to be either a pigeon or a dove. And number two, all you do is present it and perhaps lay hands on it. But you're not the one who slaughters it. Your priest is the one who slaughters it. He's the one that wrings off the head. He's the one that prepares it by plucking the feather and removing the crop and tossing it into the ash heap. And he's the one that does everything from there on out. So there are a couple of differences. Now, why would you need to bring a bird? Why wouldn't you bring a sheep or a goat? Why wouldn't you bring a bull? Why would you bring a pigeon or a dove? The answer, I think, comes to us out of the 5th chapter of Leviticus, Leviticus 5, verse 7, I believe it is. If you cannot afford to bring a sheep, you may bring to the Lord 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons as the penalty for your sin. So talking about another type of sacrifice, if you can't afford a sheep, then you bring a dove. Doves are the poor man's offering. Several hundred years later, about 1,400 years after Leviticus, people would come to the temple to offer these sacrifices from hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And it's very impractical for you to try to take your bull and walk it down the road not 1,400 miles, but several hundred miles to get to the temple. So what people would do is instead they would sell their bull and they would take the money, sort of liquidate their assets, is what we might say today, and they would take the money to Jerusalem and they would buy another bull and then they would sacrifice that bull. So it's a lot easier. What that means is that all of the bulls in Jerusalem are suddenly very, very valuable because there's only so many to go around. So if you want to offer a bull, well, you're gonna have to pay a pretty penny. So you sell your bull for maybe, $500, and you get to Jerusalem, and suddenly that same type of bull is now $800. Okay, it's price gouging. One day, Jesus went into the temple, and he sees all of this buying and selling going on. Matthew 21. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling what? Doves. Who sacrificed doves? The poor. Jesus, in knocking over specifically the chairs of those selling doves, Jesus is sticking up for the poor. He's sticking up for the people on food stamps, those who are on welfare, those who are on the WIC program. He's sticking up for those who scrounge to get enough to pay their rent every month. That's who Jesus is sticking up for when he turns over at the tables of those selling doves, because this is the poor man's sacrifice. Now, as we talk about the burnt offering, I would imagine that already your mind is starting to jump to the New Testament. If you're familiar with the New Testament, I imagine you're already starting to see some parallels. But let me just reel you back in before we do that, because ultimately this isn't a series about what do the Gospels say. This is a series about what does Leviticus say? What does it teach in its own right? Now, I understand it comes to us out of a larger body of teaching, but it teaches things too. What does Leviticus say? So let's talk about that for a minute. One thing that I think Leviticus teaches is that we are only made right with God through sacrifice. We are only made right with God through sacrifice. No amount of feeling sorry for what I did, no amount of apologizing, no amount of trying to make it better is going to remove what happened. The only way to truly be forgiven is sacrifice, because sin merits death. And so I have to bring not only an animal, but I have to bring an animal that's pure and without defect. Why does it have to be without defect? Because I have defects. I'm stained. If I were to be sacrificed, it wouldn't be enough because I'm tainted. And so I not only need death to happen for my forgiveness, but death of something that's better and purer than I am. But we are only made right with God through sacrifice. The second thing that I think Leviticus teaches is, we see it, not equal offering. Let's go back to that slide. At the end of verse 9 and 13 and 17, which is at the end of the bull, the end of the goat, and the end of the birds, we have this refrain. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. It's a burnt offering. It's a burnt offering. So what Leviticus says in chapter 1 is, if you bring a bull and you do this to it, prepare, lay hands, slaughter, splatter, prepare, and burn. If you do that, it is an Olah. And if you do this with a goat, it is also an Olah. And if you do this with a bird, it is also an Olah. No matter which animal you're presenting, it's always the same kind of sacrifice that attains the same kind of effect for different people. Perhaps you could say it like this: not equal offering, but equal sacrifice. Perhaps you can bring a bull. If you can afford to bring a bull, bring a bull. But if you can't afford to bring a bull, God doesn't expect you to bring a bull, but you can bring a pigeon. Equal offering, or equal sacrifice, not equal offering. Jesus actually tells a story about this. There were two people in the temple that went to offer sacrifices, or went to give money into the temple treasury. And one was this very rich man who's giving tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the other is this poor woman who only gives 2 cents. And Jesus says she gave more because her sacrifice was greater. Her offering wasn't the same, but her sacrifice was greater because it was everything she had. There are some among us for whom $10 is nothing. $100 is nothing. It wouldn't be missed. And there are others among us who $10 is the difference between paying rent and not paying rent. And I don't know who is who. I've never seen a single check in the offering. I don't know who gives what. And I don't want to know who gives what. But if you can afford to bring a bull, you don't bring a pigeon. And if all you can afford is a pigeon, you don't have to bring a bull. Because the principle is not equal offering, it's equal sacrifice. A third thing that I think Leviticus 1 teaches us is this: anybody can have a relationship with God. Anybody. Whether you are poor or rich, whether you were brought up the right way or if you were brought up a different way, or however you want to say that, no matter if you're guilty, if you're innocent, if you are wrestling with questions or doubts, or I just don't know a whole lot, or I don't really have that great of a relationship with so-and-so, no matter who you are, where you come from, anybody can have a relationship with God. Even the guilty and the stained are allowed to come into the presence of God to make atonement. Now, by this point, hopefully, there are like blinking lights in Leviticus, which you probably never thought would happen, but you're starting to think, this actually means something. And if it's not, then I'll just say it. Jesus is our burnt offering. He was presented as a male without defect. He was accepted as our proxy. He was slaughtered, murdered on a cross. His blood was splattered against his altar, which the writer of Hebrews tells us is the cross itself. He was prepared by Mary, who wept and poured oil and perfume on his feet and dried them with her hair. And he was offered completely to God. He is our burnt offering through which atonement is made. Now, that being said, there are a couple of things that we need to talk about. Number one, Jesus does not just take the imagery of the burnt offering. It's not like, oh, you look at Jesus and you look at the burnt offering and they're very similar. No, actually, Jesus does what the burnt offering was designed to do in the first place. Jesus does what the burnt offering was designed to do. The writer of Hebrews says in chapter 10, verse 4, "It is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." The writer of Hebrews contends that for hundreds and hundreds of years, as people would bring their sacrifices, their bulls and goats and birds, that their blood never actually accomplished anything. Their blood never did anything, because it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. What that means is that the only thing that can take away sins for anybody living in any period of time is the blood of Jesus. Well, so what then of the people that lived before, those who were coming to the temple in the tabernacle offering sacrifices? What of them? Well, the writer of Hebrews tells us that the reason for the sacrifice is that it purifies our conscience. It doesn't take away our sins, but it purifies our conscience. Perhaps what we need is just to feel a little blood on our hands. What we need is not an animal to die in our place, but maybe we needed to go through this for us to feel ourselves doing something. We needed to somehow be engaged because we are a people, we are a species that's always got to be doing something. And we can't just sit back. And so for those who lived before Jesus, them coming to bring a sacrifice, it was for them a way of purifying their conscience. But for those of us who live after the time of Jesus, well, to offer a sacrifice, to kill a bull or a goat would be essentially to deny that Jesus accomplished anything. And so, well, then what are we supposed to do about our conscience? I mean, we carry around guilty consciences with us. We also feel guilty. We also kind of sometimes wish that there was something that we could do, like splattering blood on an altar, that would make us feel better, make us feel like we've actually done something. Well, there are actually two things that we can do. Number one, we can trust. We trust that what God has done for us is enough. We trust that what Jesus accomplished was sufficient and that nothing else is needed. And so that offense between me and my spouse, that argument that I had with my roommate, that thing between me and my boss, I don't need to feel guilty about that anymore. I don't need to feel a guilty conscience because Jesus has already taken my guilty conscience. The second thing we can do is we can live. How do we purify our conscience? Well, we live with a pure heart. We live with righteousness and sexual purity and hospitality and grace, with a pure mouth, with pure thoughts. We live, and this is how we purify our conscience. And then finally, the second thing that I think we can get from Jesus is that through his sacrifice, all people draw near to God. As you read the book of Acts and the story of the early church, what they did in the decades following the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, we see that it begins with the Jews. The Jewish people are the first ones to receive Jesus. And then after a couple of chapters, the message of the gospel starts going to the Samaritans. Well, they're like half-bloods. They're half-breeds. They can't be accepted into the presence of God because they're not like us. They're not full breeds. And then after a while, it even goes to people they're called God-fearing Gentiles. Gentiles who have been going to the synagogue and they've been trying to obey God and doing all the right things. And the gospel goes to them too. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Acts, the gospel has gone all over the world to people who weren't even seeking God, who had no knowledge that there is a God out there to obey. The message has reached all people that through this one man, Jesus Christ, all people can be right with God. That he isn't just the God of the Jews, he's also the God of the Gentiles. Still the God of the Jews, but he's also the God of the Gentiles, because there's only one. So this message reaches out. In fact, Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome. And in Rome at the time, the Gentile Christians were starting to think that because we're Gentiles, God has favored us. Because he's accepted us sort of into his program, he must love us, and that must mean he's rejected the Jews. God doesn't want the Jews anymore. That we have supplanted the Jews. And Paul writes them to say, no, if people have to stop obeying kosher and Sabbath and all the festivals and all of that, if they have to stop being Jewish in order to be a Christian, then God is only the God of the Gentiles. And he's not the God of the whole world. In the book of Galatians, he writes to this a couple of churches around the area of Galatia where the problem is just the opposite. You've got people saying, if you really want to be a Christian, you have to observe kosher and you have to observe the Sabbath, and you have to be a Jew if you're going to be a Christian. And Paul writes Galatians to say, no, if you have to be a Jew to be a Christian, then God is only the God of the Jews and he's not the God of the Gentiles. But there's only one God. And so the contention of Paul is that all people can draw near to God through Jesus, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, no matter what questions they're dealing with, no matter what doubts or fears they have, no matter what they were brought up believing, no matter what they do on weekends, no matter who or what they are, all people can be made right with God, which is a radical, radical idea. And the third thing is that we walk around with this sort of stench of the burnt offering. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, our lives are like a fragrant, Christ-like offering rising up to God. But this fragrance is perceived differently by those who are being saved and by those who are perishing. Our lives are like this fragrance that's perceived differently by those who are saved and those who are not. To those who are perishing, we're a dreadful smell of death and doom, but to those who are being saved, we are a life-giving perfume. Can you imagine being a young Jewish child and growing up in the wilderness as the camp moves from one place to another and the tabernacle always being in the center of the camp? The smell of burning flesh is constantly wafting through the camp. And you're brought up being told that, my child, is the smell of forgiveness. That is what it smells like when God makes atonement for someone. Now suppose instead you are a Gentile, you've never been familiar with this practice, and you come into the camp and you smell this dreadful smell of burning flesh. To you, it's just the smell of death, because you don't know what it means. Paul says it's the same way. When we bring our sacrificial burnt offering, when we live with this sort of blood on our hands of living right and trusting that God has done enough, when we do that, we walk around as though the smell of a burnt offering has seeped into our clothing. And to those who get it, to those who know why we're doing it, it is the smell of life. It's the smell of forgiveness. But to those who don't understand, it just smells like death because you're wasting your life. You're wasting your life living this way. So it all depends on whether or not you understand why we do this. So may you draw near to this God who atones for us. May you see that sometimes forgiveness feels a bit like this. And may you trust in this one all-sufficient Olah, Jesus.